Okay, so it's 11 o'clock, so we will get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Kristen Reed, and I am a research coordinator here at Health Evidence. We are very pleased that you're able to join us today to talk about the effectiveness of behavioral interventions for improving cognition and school achievement in youth who are overweight or obese. In a few moments, I'll be introducing the authors of this paper who have joined us today and who we are thrilled to have share their work in this area. But we would like to take some time to wish a warm welcome to our presenters and also to welcome all of our health evidence users that have joined us for this webinar today. So throughout the session today, we will be posting polling questions through the WebEx platform. Your participation in polling questions is voluntary and anonymous. And I'm just going to leave this consent slide up for a moment to give you a chance to review, and then I'll move on shortly. All right, so just to let you know that after today, the PowerPoint presentation and the audio recording will be made available on Health Evidence's YouTube and SlideShare accounts, usually within the next week or so, and the links to both of those resources will be posted in the chat section by Kate now, so you can access them at your leisure. So today we are very excited to be talking about the review of physical activity, diet, and other behavioral interventions for improving cognition and school achievement in children and adolescents with obesity or overweight. The link to the Health Evidence Review page for this systematic review will be posted in the chat section, and you can click on this link and follow along in the review using the article full text or PubMed link out. So just a few more housekeeping items before we dive in. Please use the chat section in WebEx to post your comments and questions. We ask that you send your questions or comments to all participants and not just to the host, as others may have similar questions as you. Also, we very much encourage you to post your questions and comments as they come to mind throughout the session. Towards the end of the session, we will save some time for the authors to respond to any questions or comments that you might have. For the best connection, we do recommend you use a wired internet connection versus wireless. And should you have any connection issues, we have posted the 24/7 WebEx helpline on this slide as well as in the chat section. For your audio today, please listen through your speakers. If you are having trouble hearing, you can go to the Communicate tab at the top bar in WebEx and then click Audio Broadcast. So we have our first polling question of the day, and we'd just like to get a sense of how many people are joining us for today's webinar. So are you joining just with yourself or in a small group of 2 to 3, 4 to 5, 6 to 10, or maybe you're joining in a larger group of over 10. So I will just leave this up for a little bit to give people a chance to respond. I will ask, please make sure to press the Submit button at the bottom after you have selected your response so that it can be logged. So from the answers that are coming in now, it looks like most people are joining today with just themselves, but we do have a few small groups of 2 to 3 as well, so that's really great to see. We would also like to give a special thanks to our health evidence team who've worked to bring this session to you today. There is a large team of us who work to keep health evidence current and maintained, as well as to coordinate our webinar series. For those of you who may not be familiar, Health Evidence is a service and research organization involved in knowledge translation for public health professionals that was launched in 2005. Our main product is a comprehensive registry of reviews where we provide over 5,000 quality-rated systematic reviews evaluating the effectiveness of public health and health promotion interventions. The main goals of health evidence are to make evidence relevant to public health more accessible and make it easier for professionals to use evidence in their decision-making. So really the value add for using health evidence is that we save you time. We have done the work to screen and appraise each review within our registry. We screen all reviews for relevance to public health and keep our repository up to date by constantly screening relevant databases. At any given time, we're no more than 1 to 2 months behind the publication date. So we have done the work for you by critically appraising all reviews through a transparent process where you can actually click on the full quality assessment for each review and see our rating for each of our 10 assessment criteria. The Health Evidence website also has various tools and supports for evidence-informed decision-making that are available online, and these, as well as our repository, are designed to both be easy and simple to use. So I'm just going to quickly touch on the model for evidence-informed decision-making to help ground our presentation today, and which we can keep in mind as the presenters go through their systematic review. So this model consists of 5 components that you can see here in this diagram. And public health practitioners and decision makers need to consider evidence from a variety of sources, including community health issues in local context, existing resources, community and political climate, and making decisions about programs and policies, and research evidence. The Health Evidence webinar series is designed to highlight findings from research evidence that are relevant to public health decisions. So on this next slide, you can see the stages of evidence-informed public health, and these help illustrate the steps that are involved in evidence-informed practice. So the wheel is a guide for practitioners and decision makers to determine how to address a particular issue by systematically incorporating evidence into the decision-making process. So we have our second polling question that we'll just open up, and we're wondering how many participants here today have heard of or are familiar with PICOs or PICO-S. All right, so I'm just opening up the side here, and it looks like I guess it's actually about a bit of a 50-50 split. So some people are familiar and some people are not as familiar with PICO-S. So for those of you who aren't familiar, PICO-S is a way for you to structure your research questions. It involves defining who the population is that you're interested in, what the intervention, program, or service is that you want to know about, the comparison group, if there is any, and outlining the specific outcomes you are looking for. So sometimes we also have a particular setting in mind, which we can also state here, for example, in a school or community setting. So the value of a PICO question is that when you have an issue that arises, you can use PICO to turn this into a searchable question, which allows you to further articulate specific components of the question and can then help you search for relevant information related to your PICO more easily and efficiently. So moving on to our next polling question, we're interested in learning how often you might use research evidence from systematic reviews to inform your own work. So this might be always, often, sometimes, or never, or you might not be familiar with what a systematic review is. So I'll leave that open for a little bit to give people a chance to respond, and just another reminder to, once you've selected your response, to click the submit button so that it can be tracked. So it does look like people are answering, and most people, I would say they often use systematic reviews, but there's some I guess always and sometimes as well, and a couple of people aren't quite sure what a systematic review is. So hopefully we'll learn about that more today. So I will move on to introducing our presenters. We are really excited to have Dr. Anne Martin and Dr. Josie Booth today to present the findings from their recent review. Dr. Anne Martin is a research associate at the MRC CSO Social and Public Health Sciences Unit at the University of Glasgow. And Dr. Josie Booth is a lecturer at the Institute for Education, Community and Society at the University of Edinburgh. So thank you all very much for joining us today, and I will pass it along to our presenters.
Thank you. This is Anne Martin speaking here, and hello to everyone. Okay, hello, this is Anne Martin speaking here, and hello to everyone, and thank you so much for joining the webinar and for your interest in our research. And so quickly about my background and why we are double act here. So I'm a physiotherapist and nutritionist and specialized in obesity and weight management, and Josie's background is in psychology, and she is the expert in all the cognitive-related outcomes that we looked at in this review. So, and we will, jointly present. So we switch between the two of us. So to give you the best information we have. So I'd like to kick off this presentation just to give you a bit of a background of the condition and the situation we are in, and why we wanted to look into this topic. So you might be well familiar with the information that obesity prevalence is relatively high. So many girls and boys aged 5 to 19 years live with obesity, and that comes from a quite recent and big publication in the Lancet that looked at huge data sets. So it's quite worrying that so many young people live with obesity, and the most worrying aspect of it is that many of these young people with obesity have also physical and mental health problems, and also experience psychosocial difficulties. So, for example, in terms of mental health problems, you might have heard that depression and anxiety are common in people with obesity, but also physical problems such as problems with joints and musculoskeletal system or metabolic issues. So more and more young people with obesity are diagnosed with also type 2 diabetes and hypertension. And in terms of psychosocial issues, we often read and hear reports of social isolation, of bullying, of stigmatization, also in the school environment. So therefore, there is a concern, and there is a need to look into interventions and supports that can help these young people. And quite recently, more and more evidence also emerged that in addition to physical, mental, psychosocial issues, also cognitive and academic consequences have been emerged. So what it means is that that some young people with obesity might perform less well in school and have some cognitive abilities are not as well developed as young people with healthy weight. So, and Josie and myself and with other colleagues, we looked into, that's the previous study that we did, we looked into longitudinal data sets, so cohort studies, and there were 17 different cohort studies from different countries, and we looked into how change in body weight status can influence academic attainment. And the graph you see here actually shows, in the inner circle shows that we looked at math, science, reading, and kind of average scores. So if you get a grade point average, for example, where multiple school subjects are combined together. And then the second inner cycle looks and shows the overweight, whether the young people were with overweight or obesity, or whether they developed obesity, whether they lost weight, or whether they maintained their body weight status over time. And what we see actually is that try to do this here. For math attainment, we actually found that especially females, so the green bars indicate that there was actually a negative link. So females or girls with obesity had actually lower math attainment scores compared to healthy weight females. But also some of those negative links were also observed for cohorts that didn't distinguish between sex, so that looked at both male and female, and that was also especially found for females and males that maintained their body weight, their high body weight, so that were obese over a longer period of time, so not just one time point. But this view, in terms of the evidence and what we see here on this graph, is really just looks into high quality studies, and we can only kind of draw these conclusions for mass attainment rather than for the other school subjects. So that is from observational research, so not experimental, not intervention research. But this is just to show there is some links, or there were some links that we observed previously in previous studies. So, and we do know in terms of obesity and weight management and for obesity in children, that clinical guidelines or general, but also public health guidelines for prevention and treatment of childhood obesity recommend changes towards healthy eating, increasing physical activity, and reducing sedentary behavior, and actually most recently also in improving sleep and ensuring that young people have adequate and enough and high quality sleep. So, and we actually also know from the literature, and this was pretty much the starting point of the present research that we present here today, is that interventions that improve physical activity actually can also benefit thinking skills and school outcomes, and equally for healthy diets. That was also shown, but that was more in the general population. So, but linking these two aspects of obesity and weight management treatment programs with and the potential of improving cognition and school attainment together, so we were interested in really exploring what is the evidence for young people with obesity in particular. And there are several theoretical mechanisms why those kind of interventions like physical activity, healthy eating, reducing sedentary behavior could actually have a greater benefit for young people with obesity. They are there, and Josie will talk about them a bit more into detail. But before that, I pass on the ball to Josie, and she can talk about what we actually mean by cognitive functions. So.
Great, thank you, Anne. It's Josie Booth here. I think I'm just waiting for control of the slides. Hang on a second, and hopefully Anne can pass me the slides so I can move them on. Great, that's it, fantastic, thank you. So to give you a bit more detail about cognitive function then, we know from other research that the benefits for health behaviour seem to really depend on the outcomes that research is interested in. So there's subtle differences between, for example, whether physical activity might have an impact on school achievement, or whether we've looked at intelligence or more higher order cognitive functions, which we label executive functions, which I'll explain a little bit more because that might not be a term that's familiar to people. So executive function is generally used as an umbrella term to capture lots of different cognitive processes. So for example, our attention, so our ability to focus on things, our working memory, which is our ability to really retrieve information while we're working on a task. So a good example of this would be doing mental arithmetic, so being able to hold information in mind while you're working through the problem. Inhibition is another core executive function, so this is the ability to really ignore distracting information or default responses. So a good example that relates to school is stopping yourself from just blurting out what you want to say and actually raising your hand before you speak. So you need to be able to inhibit your response to speak and raise your hand. Or a more real world, well, everyday problem was stopping ourselves from eating something just before dinner because it will spoil your appetite. So being able to really control your behavior. The other core executive function is cognitive flexibility. So this is the ability to really switch between doing two different tasks. So changing rules and responses, changing your course of action. So if something comes along your path, being able to change what you're doing. My example in this slide is, which I'm not going to recommend, is texting while driving requires you to do this cognitive flexibility, so doing two different things at once. So I'm sure you can think of other better examples of that. But these are really the cognitive processes that we're interested in. What we'd like you to do now then is open another polling question. We'd like you to think about whether in your own practice you've noticed whether children with overweight or obesity have had any difficulties with things such as attention, memory, problem solving or decision making, or indeed school achievement as well. So I'll give you a few moments to answer those questions.
Wonderful, thank you, Josie. And as the answers are coming in, and there are still people submitting, it looks like I guess it's actually pretty evenly split again. So with about 20% yes and 20% no, and then several non-responses. So that's really interesting.
Great, thank you very much. So it sounds like some people are certainly noticing that young people are having these difficulties then when you're out in practice. So I'd just like to explain some of the causal links now that we notice and kind of highlight what Anne was saying about these theoretical models. So there's two ways in which obesity can have an impact on school achievement. One of these is a direct impact. So obesity has been found to be linked to changes in brain morphology and brain structure. So, for example, it has an impact on things like brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It has an impact on terms of growth and development of particular aspects of the brain, and in particular, it can be the frontal lobes of the brain as well. So obesity has a direct impact on the brain, which will lead to a change in school achievement and potentially future success. There are also indirect relationships as well. So obesity can lead to problems with health concerns, such as diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and mental health problems. It can also lead to psychosocial issues such as poor self-esteem, discrimination from other pupils or teachers, social isolation, stigmatism, and actually through lower school attendance because of health problems. There's also impact where obesity can impact directly on neurocognitive things such as working memory and attention, and also the impact that obesity can have on lifestyle concerns such as inactivity, unhealthy diet, and sedentary lifestyle. And we can see that there's what we call bidirectional arrows within these relationships. So obesity will have an impact on health concerns could have an impact on our psychosocial health, but we also know that our psychosocial health has an impact on our physical health. So, for example, if you are depressed and have low self-esteem, you're going to find it difficult to take part in physical activity. So this is a two-way street in this model. So we think that obesity through each of these areas will also have an impact in terms of school achievement. So it's quite a complex relationship, but it means that there's many different impacts that obesity might be having that all will lead to problems in terms of school achievement and lower future success. Okay. So to just pick up that idea of this bidirectionality a little bit further then, we know that children with obesity show higher impulsivity and problems with their attention. They also have a lower sensitivity to rewards, so they're less responsive to this, and they have problems with this idea of inhibition and cognitive flexibility when they're compared to healthy weight peers. So we know that children with obesity show problems within these cognitive areas. We also show that these cognitive problems are associated with things that we would think are related to weight problems. So, for example, inability to inhibit your response can lead to uncontrolled food intake and also problems with physical activity behaviour. So we think that these neurocognitive reasons might predict our weight gain. We also know from intervention treatment that weight loss is associated with improvements in these cognitive functions, and we find that in both children and adults in previous research. So we see this bidirectional relationship. The key thing there is it's this old idea of the chicken and the egg, that we don't know which comes first. So whether there's a problem with weight gain that leads to problems with cognition, or whether the cognitive problems mean that you're less able to control your weight. And actually this relationship works both ways. Okay. Now I'm going to pass over to Anne now, who will be able to talk through a bit more of the methods that we used in our review.
Sorry, Anne, are you on mute by chance?
Yes. Sorry, I forgot to put on the mic, so it's on.
Yeah, no,
sorry for that. So, so I talk about the method. So this systematic review was done is a Cochrane review. So for those who don't know what a Cochrane review is, it's done with help and under guidance of the Cochrane collaboration. And the Cochrane collaboration is an international institution with kind of Cochrane groups and centers all over the world with the aim to synthesize health evidence to inform health care decisions. And the Cochrane collaboration set out a very rigorous and methodologies of how to do a systematic review. And the good thing with being a Cochrane author and doing a Cochrane review is that you get a lot of support as well when doing it. So, and this Cochrane review is done with the Developmental Psychosocial Learning Problems group. So within Cochrane there are over 50 different groups that are specialized in a certain topic. So, and for this systematic review, our peak course that we use, you can see here on the top half of the slide, was that we're interested, as you probably figured by now, in children and young people with obesity. And we were, in terms of the intervention, we were interested in any type of intervention that is currently recommended as a weight management intervention. So things like surgery, bariatric surgery, or medication, or even supplementation, like vitamin supplementation or so. These kind of interventions were not considered. So very much we were looking into physical activity, dietary, sedentary behavior, psychological interventions, these type of interventions that are typically part of a weight management regime. In terms of the comparison conditions, we were interested in pretty much any type of comparison condition. So it could be a weightless control, so where the comparison group would wait until they receive the intervention as well, but for a certain amount of time, as long as the intervention lasts. Then standard practice, and you will see that most of the interventions we looked at actually had a standard practice, or usual care, it's sometimes called, comparison group. So that means that whatever is the current practice in school or doing a weight management service, that is standard practice, something that is rolled out, that is maybe even a policy, regulated policy, but any new intervention on top of that was the intervention that we were interested in, and we compared to what is going on already. Other type of comparison conditions were, for example, an attention control, so where children or families received a different type of intervention. Let's say while the intervention participants did some physical activity interventions, the participants of the comparison group, they received, for example, a leaflet with information about oral health. So, or some other type of activities that kind of accounted or simulated the attention that the intervention participants receive, similarly for the comparison participants. In terms of the outcomes, we were interested in any cognitive outcomes or any academic outcomes. So in terms of standardized test scores or grade point average, and in terms of school performance, there could have been teacher-assessed school achievement or standardized test scores using psychometric test batteries. And in terms of the cognition outcomes, we were only interested in outcomes that were assessed using validated test batteries. So, for example, parent perceived cognition or participant perceived cognitive abilities, for example, for problem solving. This is not, we did not consider this for this review. And our in the PICO was not setting, it was rather, we interpreted it as studies. So because we didn't restrict our review to any setting. So we were, any intervention in any setting was relevant for us, but we wanted to restrict the review to intervention studies. So we excluded observational research or case control studies. So, and we did the search in 2017, yeah, that's right, in the beginning of early 2017, and we searched 17 electronic databases, 2 trial registers, and checked the reference list of studies that were eligible for inclusion, and also reference lists of systematic reviews on similar topics. And we also contacted authors in the field, and that was actually quite a substantial body of work that we did. We contacted a lot of authors because most of the data we were interested in, so mainly a subgroup of the general population, so that means young people with obesity. Often authors didn't really report the information in their papers, in their published studies, so we went back, contacted them, and asked them to provide us the data specifically for young people with obesity. And then after sifting through more than 20,000 records, we identified 18 randomized controlled trials, so RCT stands for randomized controlled trials. And I have to say, this publication, this is a Cochrane review, was an update Cochrane review. So in 2014, we published our first version of this Cochrane review, and we had 6 studies, 6 randomized controlled trials included. So, and in now the early 2018, we published this review. 12 more randomized controlled trials were conducted and could be included in the systematic review. So that alone shows that there is quite an interest in the topic over the last 4 years. So, and an additional point I'd like to make in terms of the methodology is, because you will see later in the slides, is that we also assess the quality of evidence. So in addition to assessing the quality of studies, which is a very, a crucial part of doing the systematic review and evidence synthesis, where individual studies are rated according to their methodology, we also then looked at the overall quality of the evidence, and that relates more to the outcome. So there could be 3 studies looking at the same outcome, let's say mass attainment, but all these 3 studies could have different methodologies and qualities. So when we look at the quality of evidence, we really are interested in the whole of the 3 studies rather than the individual studies. And we use the GRADE framework, and GRADE rates the quality of evidence as either high, moderate, low, or very low. And there are 5 factors contributing as to whether the quality of evidence is downgraded, or even it can also be upgraded. So randomized controlled trials usually start with a high quality of evidence, as they are at times considered as the highest quality of evidence, according to the GRADE framework. And then, depending on the methodological quality of the studies contributing to the evidence for a particular outcome, you can also look into how different the effect sizes are between the studies in terms of direction. So one says, yes, there is an effect, the other one says, no, there is not an effect. So kind of this inconsistency in effect direction is considered for determining the quality, but also how precise the effect sizes, or how much variation within the effect sizes we can see. And there are other factors as well, like indirectness and publication bias. So, and what do these quality ratings actually mean? So we assign a high quality rating to evidence, to quality evidence, that actually means that we are quite confident in the effect estimate, and that if there is new evidence emerging in the future, that it is quite unlikely for the effect estimate to change. If we assign a moderate quality evidence to a certain outcome, then our confidence in the effect estimate is likely to be lower, and if with new evidence emerging, there might be a change, and low and very low quality evidence actually indicates that it is very likely that the effect estimate will change with new evidence emerging. So maybe you want to keep that in mind when we go into presenting the results of the findings. So moving on to what we actually found through our literature search. So of these 18 randomized controlled trials, there were 2 trials that were conducted in children and young people with obesity which were of preschool age, so 3 to 5 years old. Then 11, so the majority of the studies we looked at, 11 studies were conducted in children of primary school age, so up to 11, 12 years. And then the remainder, 5 studies were in adolescents, so up to actually 19 years. There was one study that also, depending on the different school systems, of course, across the country, some 19-year-olds also are still in high school. So, and in terms of interventions, as you can imagine, they were quite diverse. So we categorized the types of interventions into interventions that only tried to improve, not just improve, but also applied or employed a physical activity interventions. So they were, I will tell a bit more about what these kind of interventions were when I present the results. So 8 studies had a physical activity interventions only. Then there were 7 studies that had a lifestyle education component in addition to an active physical activity component. And 3 studies, 3 interventions, were nutrition-related interventions. So it could be changes in the school meal provision, but all of the 3 interventions also had a nutrition education component to them. So in terms of the outcomes that we actually then had data for, there were 5 school achievement outcomes. So we had math, reading, language as the common ones that we would expect, but then there were also some authors again reported on kind of an average score across multiple subjects, and then one of the studies also looked at the attainment scores for a subject called health class. So could be, that was actually an American study. So health class is not a subject that exists in the UK, but an equivalent could be something that like health and well-being or subjects like that in school. In terms of cognitive function, so there was executive function, and we called it composite executive function. Apologies. I will pass on the ball to Josie in a minute to say what we actually mean by composite executive function. But then we also had inhibition, control, attention, memory, and there are different types of memories: working, non-verbal, verbal memories. Then visual-spatial abilities, cognitive flexibility, Josie mentioned that, and general intelligence. So I let Josie say a bit more about some of those cognitive functions outcomes we actually have some evidence for.
Great, thank you. So just to add into what Anne was saying there, so there were some studies where the authors had used several measures of executive function, but rather than presenting a score for each of them separately, they'd grouped those scores together as a composite executive function score or a global score. So that type of score is not as useful because we know that there are differences between impacts on inhibition and working memory, for example. So we, within the review, looked at each of the separate executive function scores as well as these composite executive function scores. So we wanted to look across the full range rather than just looking at the summary scores. As I said, we've also looked at inhibition, attention, working memory. These visual spatial abilities were really related to more general intelligence measures, but when authors specifically reported differences for visual spatial IQ in comparison to general intelligence and then cognitive flexibility. Now I'm going to pass back to Anne, who's going to start talking about the results for you.
Okay, thank you, Josie. So when we talk about the results, you will notice, and I make the point at the beginning actually, is that even though we had 18 randomized controlled trials included in the systematic review, the type of outcomes reported in each of these trials were quite different. So that means for each of these outcomes, we only have at times only 3 studies that we actually could combine the intervention effects in a meta-analysis, and the majority of the outcomes we assessed were actually just from 1 or 2 studies. So that will have implication when we look into like future research as well. So let's start with the first comparison that we looked at, so physical activity interventions versus standard practice. So one group of young people with obesity received a physical activity intervention, the other discontinued as it was common practice, so with their usual physical activity routine that is offered in school, for example. And so yeah, as I said, there were 8 studies that actually had these physical activity only interventions, but only one study looked at executive function, and that's a composite executive function outcome. And what we, based on that single study, we can, which was of high quality, I have to say, we can say that offering a physical activity program improved executive function skills compared to not offering this physical activity program. And at the bottom of the slide, you see a bit more description of what they actually did. And that was also the same study that looked at non-verbal memory, and it also improved in those children with obesity who were part of the intervention group. And the difference in scores for executive function was that those in the intervention group had improvement of executive function by 5 points compared to the comparison condition, and in memory there was an improvement of 3 points. And you see the details here on the scale and the numbers of participants as well. If you have more questions about what type of test tools were used, we can go into detail later if you want to. But in terms of the intervention, you might be interested in what did they actually do with the young people. So it was an aerobic group exercise program. It was an after-school program, and that was conducted in primary school aged children aged 8 to 11 years old, and they were offered this program 5 times a week over 13 weeks in total. And after a 5-minute warm-up phase, the young people participated in quite high-intensity activities. So the facilitators tried to keep the heart rate pretty high of more than 150 beats per minute, and they did so through running games, tag games, rope, jump rope, and basketball and football. And all of these, as a reminder, these children were with obesity, so there needed to be some modifications to allow for the young people to actually engage in those games in an enjoyable way. And they did so as well by not adding a competitive component to the activities. And they were really focused on enjoyment and fun rather than trying to improve a certain skill or competing against each other. So this type of activity proved to be beneficial in children with primary school age children with obesity for their executive function and memory skills. So we also had evidence of moderate quality evidence, or moderate quality. That study is called Movie Kids, and it was a study in Spain, based in Spain. The previous one was from the States. So the moderate quality evidence on general intelligence actually also indicated benefits of that particular study called Movie Kids in children who participated in the intervention compared to standard practice. So that Movie Kids intervention, what did they do? So that was a pretty complex intervention, and it's a preschool intervention actually. So in younger children, and it was a extracurricular, non-competitive physical activity program over 4.5 hours per week, and in addition to the active physical activity component, participants also received, the parents of the participants actually received information about physical activity and how to increase physical activity in their children, and this type of informative session was also delivered to teachers. And what also happened in that intervention, and that it was the only study that we found, they also changed the built environment, as we call it, so the playground was changed in terms of the equipment provided, the facilities. They painted it and really changed the playground environment to promote uptake on using it, and therefore increasing physical activity. So again, this Movie Kids study showed that the general intelligence as the outcome was improved in children with overweight and obesity. One notion to that study, as you can see here from the sample size, this study was targeted at the entire school population pretty much, so, and we looked at subgroup data specifically. Then there were a number of other studies that also looked at math and reading, but those studies didn't find any improvements in these outcomes between intervention and comparison group. Okay, and then we have why is it not moving? I was here already. Sorry, I just struggled to move the slides. And then we also had low quality evidence for inhibition control for physical activity only interventions. So, looking into the next set of interventions that added a health education component to the physical activity intervention, actually what we found there, even though again we had 7 studies, there weren't many studies included for each of the outcomes, but regardless of the outcome looked at, what we found is that there's low and very low quality evidence of no benefit of these interventions on average scores, math or reading, and also on cognitive abilities like inhibition, control, attention, and memory, nonverbal memory. So as I said earlier, that means for us that if and when new evidence emerges, it is likely that we see a difference in the effects. So we might see actually a beneficial effect in physical activity interventions that have a health education component. But what we looked at, we didn't see any effect, and we rated this quality of evidence as low and very low evidence. And the last set of interventions were the dietary interventions, including an education component. I have a little problem here at the moment, sorry. Josie, can you move on? I have a technical problem with my screen.
Yeah, happily, Anne. At the moment, we can see the slide that you were talking about in terms of comparing dietary interventions to standard practice. So when we were looking at these types of interventions, again, we found the quality of the evidence here very low. So as Anne was suggesting, it might be the case that if new studies come out looking at dietary interventions, then actually they might have a big impact in terms of what the results are. So we found there were two studies then that looked at improvements of the school food environment, and we found that there was an impact of these studies on average achievement across subjects that were being taught. And I'll get you to give me a thumbs up when you're back with us. Okay, I think Anne's still having a technical problem here. Okay, so to give you a bit more detail about the interventions then, they were whole school approaches, so they involved training teachers, giving material there, changing the school meals that were offered, so making sure that they were nutrient-dense food, and also providing information, nutrition counselling, so to try and give as much information as well as changing the environment there. One in particular was the Project Breakfast study, where again this aims to improve school breakfast program for students, and there's a number of studies that use this approach to try and encourage young people to eat good breakfast at the start of the day. So these interventions, although they're low quality, they did seem to have an impact in terms of the average achievement across all subjects taught, but there wasn't enough data there for us to look at individual subjects. I think Anne's still having technical problems, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. Okay, and then if Anne wants to add anything else that I've missed out, she can come back and tell us. Okay, so these results give the overall effects of these studies in terms of BMI Z scores, so whether the studies also had an impact in terms of the BMI. Now, there are a number of interventions there that were specifically developed for children with obesity, and it aims to improve both weight status and cognition. And I'll talk you through what we see here. So if you look at the top of the slide then, we see that there were 3 studies that found that there was a beneficial effect on school achievement. But you see there's big diversity there on the outcomes of the studies. There are also a few studies that might have an impact on BMI, but they had no beneficial effect on school achievement. Then again, a number of studies that were beneficial in terms of cognitive function, and some of them had a benefit on weight and some of them didn't. And then again, a very mixed bag, if you like, in terms of those that didn't have an impact on cognitive function, in terms of some having an impact on weight and some not having an impact on weight. So the evidence there is very mixed. I think Anne is back with us, so I'm going to pass over to Anne to see if she's got something more to add there.
Okay, thanks, Josie, and apologies, suddenly my screen went off. I don't know what happened there, but I'm now back on. So, yeah, one more point I'd like to make for on the slide where you see the effect sizes for BMI Z-score plotted. So what we can see here is that, as I mentioned earlier, so some of the studies we included that actually specifically targeted the intervention and designed the intervention for young people with obesity, but some of the interventions were targeted at the general population, and we extracted subgroup data. And what we can see here from those, from looking at the BMI scores, is actually that studies that specifically developed the intervention for young people with obesity, they demonstrated both a beneficial effect on school achievement or cognition, and also changes in weight stages towards losing weight. That's maybe something to highlight here. On the other hand, so these were these two studies, the Huang 2015 and Davis 2011. These were specifically for children with overweight and obesity, and the other studies were primarily targeted the general population. So one could think that we might not see a benefit on cognition or body weight because they didn't specifically develop the intervention for the young people, or there might be the interventions were too complex, or there are different explanations for that. But one from a statistical point of view could be that the studies that is where we just use subgroup data, so data from the subpopulation of that actually participated in the intervention, indicated that there wasn't enough statistical power to detect an effect for that particular population group that we looked at specifically. So so that doesn't mean that the interventions we looked at cannot have that they are not beneficial for the general population as well. So where are we? Yes. So I think we are then close to just summarizing what we found overall. And so, looking at the BMI Z-score data, overall, when looking at all the 18 studies that we included, we cannot really say that there is a very clear pattern of, yes, if you improve your cognition or if you improve your school attainment, you then also lose weight. So that this direction is not something we can actually pull out from our study. And also we didn't do like a quantitative analysis here because they were all different interventions and different study populations, and not enough data to really pull them all together. In terms of cognitive function and physical activity only, this is the sign here, physical activity only interventions, so we mainly found benefits of an aerobic exercise after school interventions on executive function and also on memory, and that was of high quality. Then there was another beneficial intervention in preschoolers on general intelligence. In terms of physical activity and healthy lifestyle education interventions, there was no evidence of a beneficial effect on cognitive skills or school achievement from all the studies we looked at. However, test result is of low quality evidence, so meaning new emerging evidence might change this outcome. And in terms of dietary interventions, there is a beneficial, we observed or we analyzed and as seen a beneficial effect of school-based nutrition initiatives on overall school achievement, so the average score so that I think think, Josie, you mentioned it right, that these school initiatives were targeting breakfast consumption and or breakfast uptake of the school breakfast group, or general, what was the other one? I can't remember. Oh yeah, school meal modification and nutrition counseling. But even though we've seen a beneficial effect of those interventions, the quality of those studies was not high, so was of low quality. So our next slide will put these results a bit into context. What does this all mean now? And I let Josie talk about this again.
Great, thank you, Anne. So to contextualize these findings then, I think it's important that people understand how difficult it is to actually improve cognition. So many of these interventions didn't aim to have that as their primary outcome, and so they weren't always focusing on that to be specific. Other types of interventions that are used to try and improve cognition in the general population that seem to have most impact are computer interventions. So an example would be a program called CogMed, which is used quite a lot in schools, which really focuses on improving working memory by repeating different working memory tasks. It's an adaptive task where the better you do, the more challenges you receive, and so on, and it responds to people's level of working memory, but it's very much focused on repeated practice using computer tasks. The other types of interventions that are really effective then tend to be things such as mindfulness training and yoga and taekwondo, and these are found in 2 recent reviews to be some of the most effective ways to improve cognition. So really the types of programs which might combine some movement with things that have a focus on your cognitive skill, such as mindfulness. So it might be, rather than recommending necessarily computer interventions, that yoga and mindfulness interventions might be the best bet, because we get the health benefit as well as the cognitive benefit. So that's certainly seen in the general population. There are a few studies that have found this in young people with obesity, so there's certainly a need for more evidence. So for example, there's some studies recently that have found that yoga improved gait, so walking processes, and also emotional functioning in children with obesity. And this is quite a nice study with their intervention, where they found that children and also their parents were reporting whether the children's mental health was improving, and they found that it did following taking part in yoga. There was also another study last year published that found that yoga improved eating and physical activity levels, but that was in the general population, so it wasn't presented on young people with obesity. So there certainly needs to be more research in this area, but it suggests that yoga might be a really good way to introduce physical activity to young people with obesity, and you might get this double whammy, if you like, of benefits for cognition as well as health. And one of the key limitations, though, certainly in the UK, is that yoga is not currently part of weight management programs, which potentially could be something that should be addressed. Okay, so in terms of the implications of our review for practice then, so it was only really physical activity and dietary interventions that we found have an impact. So there's some evidence then that these other interventions might be effective in improving small improvements in school achievements, and specifically in terms of executive functions and memory. This might help in terms of decision making. So really thinking about promoting physical activity and healthy eating in schools. We often think of it in terms of additional motivation to help young people take part and in physical activity if they know that there might be cognitive improvements as well as physical improvements. So that can help motivate teachers to help support these types of interventions, as well as parents if they have a focus on school outcomes and cognition. So it's important in terms of justifying why we're doing these types of programs. One of the key issues in the review, though, is that the evidence doesn't let us draw these really strong conclusions in terms of other types of interventions. We're not saying that they have an absolute no benefit, and it may be that actually we need to have more studies to look at this, and we might see these outcomes changing, and potentially they could change just from the addition of 1 or 2 new studies if they're conducted well. So while we have some good evidence for some of our outcomes, we need better high-quality evidence in terms of making strong conclusions of other things. But certainly physical activity and dietary interventions are beneficial in terms of young people's school attainment and cognition. Okay. So our conclusions then, we found that there's these co-benefits then of lifestyle interventions in terms of cognitive skills and school achievement. Importantly, again, we didn't find a benefit for every aspect that we looked at, but we did find in terms of some aspects of school achievement and cognition. It's important that we remember that there's a really small body of high-quality evidence, and that there needs to be much better level of evidence for these other types of interventions. And key, we think then, is that lifestyle interventions should really also think about benefits that they might have in terms of cognition and school achievement. Okay, I'm going to pass over to Anne now in case she has any final comments here.
Yeah, thank you, Josie. Yeah, just the final point I'd like to make here is that actually as part of this systematic review and evidence synthesis, we also, of course, identified ongoing studies, and which is a very positive to see for us that there are actually studies in the pipeline that do take some of our concerns into consideration already, even though I haven't seen the research, our evidence here. But, for example, they address other components of weight management or healthy lifestyle, such as reducing sedentary time. And, for example, there is an ongoing study looking into implementing standing desks in school and how standing desks can actually not only help reducing sedentariness, but also increase concentration, and through that hopefully then also attainment in school. Or other interventions that are ongoing at the moment, looking into maybe in a more low-income setting, and see how physical activity or healthy eating can impact there. Or also what we found, not many of those studies actually focused on adolescents, on from 12 to 16. So the majority of the interventions were in primary school age children. And of course, conducting interventions, at least in the UK, in the secondary school setting is a bit more challenging than in the primary school setting. But adolescence is such an important period in the life course for lots of changes, and in particular also for brain development, and education is also so important during adolescence, because it determines what happens in the future, and then again they are the start of a new generation as well. So yeah, and what is another point actually that's important is there are so many clinical trials and implemented weight management programs out there that still only focus on the kind of more physical or psychological outcomes, but not kind of ignoring that the cognitive benefits are actually important to consider, and they could actually inform treatment as well. So that's another conclusion of the review, that these other outcomes, the non-clinical outcomes, should also be assessed for clinical weight management. Okay, but so yeah, Josie talked about that yoga has some potential, and what we would like to know, and that we are quite interested in, is whether yoga or some other mindfulness interventions or activities are part of your practice or practice in schools where you are, and what your experiences of yoga or mindfulness in terms of concentration, school attainment in young people with obesity in particular, but the general population as well. So we would like to kick off the discussion question time with a question directed to you.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Anne and Josie. It's really great to have a really good overview of your review, and it's really great to have your insight on the details of the intervention. I will encourage people to start adding their questions to the chat box, as well as to perhaps let us know what you think about yoga or mindfulness-based interventions in school settings. Maybe specifically from your experience in Canada. So I definitely encourage you to please add your thoughts into there. We do have one comment that mentions, so more of a comment that mentions that there are some other groups doing lit reviews on this topic, but I'm not sure exactly who that audience is. So if you'd like to clarify, please let us know. And also a comment that it is very important to examine the strength of evidence, since it looks logical to associate these factors, but it's not really an easy cause-effect linkage. And I think that's something that you very much showed us today. Do you have any further comments on that?
I can just agree. Yeah, I mean, this topic is quite complex, and disentangling the even moderating effects or moderator or I lost the word. Josie, if you can think of the other word I want to say, is quite difficult. And of course, with systematic reviews, we kind of work with what authors give us, right? What they report, and even though we have been in contact with most authors, it is quite difficult getting the information we really want to know. And yes, assessing the quality of evidence is key for decision makers, because we cannot expect a reader of a full complex systematic review to make their own judgment on the quality, given that there are so many factors contributing to the quality of evidence. But so yeah, I don't know if that answers or adds anything to the comment.
That's great. Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And we do have another comment here in response to the question that you posed. Just that they have heard of a few schools that are doing meditation and mindfulness exercises right at the beginning of the school day, and have seen some great improvements in behavior, concentration, and attention throughout the day. So I'm going to take a guess that probably is somewhere in Canada. And then also another comment, just that I believe it's some of the public health departments in Canada that are doing this lit review right now. So that would be maybe really interesting to connect about in at least two of our provinces, but they haven't been published yet. I guess on that note, is that do you have information or to kind of position how the work that you've done in this systematic review really compares to what else is kind of out there in this field?
In terms of benefits of weight management interventions for cognition. So most of the systematic reviews that we came across look at just one of the aspects of weight management. So it's either physical activity or diet, although on diet there I haven't seen a recent one. But yeah, so broadly the physical activity systematic review literature also indicates benefits for the general population. And I think quite recently there was a systematic review from colleagues in the States that also looked at physical activity intervention specifically for young people with obesity and impact on their thinking skills. And again, they found pretty much the same. So yes, there is consistency. So more and more individual study evidence is emerging as well. As I said, some are ongoing. So it's a good time, let's put it that way, and then let's say 1-2 years time, I think we can draw maybe different conclusions or confirm the conclusions we've drawn here. with more departments, centers, units doing research on the topic. What is still not very consistent, and again that's consistent with our findings, is really looking into how this change in cognition really benefits weight loss or management of obesity. So there is still like a very recent one. I think I provided the reference. The next 2 slides, or 3 slides actually, provide references. There is a reference, Pierce, actually it's there, Pierce et al. Published a meta-analysis on childhood obesity. So also looking into, what comes first, and like Josie said, in terms of the direction and how can weight management then, where are we in the causal relationship there? So there's still a lot to do, but broadly, current evidence confirms what we found here. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the systematic review on yoga and mindfulness. When it's ready.
Wonderful. That's awesome. So I do continue to please encourage people to add their comments and any questions they have for our authors today in the chat box. I have a couple of slides myself that I'm just going to go through to wrap up at the moment. But yes, please continue to add your thoughts into that chat box that I can then relay to our authors today. Again, there is just a couple more polling questions that we have for you today. And we would just like to know if you think this information that was presented today is helpful in the work that you do. So strongly agree, neutral, disagree, and strongly disagree. So I will give a few moments for people to respond, and also just another quick reminder to please press the submit button once you've selected your response. So it looks like there's a couple people just in the process of answering, but overall, most people agree or strongly agree that this information was useful, so that's really great. And at this point, really, I would also like to share a few options for ways that you can interact with health evidence moving forward. So this includes visiting our website, receiving our monthly tailored registry updates and/or monthly newsletter to stay up to date on new research and upcoming events. Telling your colleagues about what's available on healthevidence.org, following us on Twitter using the @healthevidence handle, and also encouraging your organization to use health evidence to search for high-quality review-level evidence to help inform program planning and policy decisions. We also encourage you to contact us if you have any suggestions for future webinar topics or to provide feedback on the series. So one more polling question, I believe, and we really would like to know, what are your next steps with after this webinar? What are you going to access the full systematic review, access the quality assessment for the review on health evidence, consider using the evidence in your own work, or telling a colleague about the evidence that you learned about today? So again, I'll just leave that open for a little bit and check to make sure that there are no other questions that have come in. And it looks like people are definitely planning on looking at the quality assessment, considering how they can use the evidence in their own practice, and sharing with their colleagues and friends. So that's really great. That's really great to see. So I'm just going to do a quick check. It doesn't look like there are any questions, but I think you mentioned you're happy to have people follow up with you after the webinar if anything does pop up. I guess just another reminder that a recording of the webinar will be available on our YouTube channel, as well as the slides on our SlideShare account after the webinar. And finally, we also have a survey that we would love that you would take, if you could take some time to give us your feedback on the webinar and the webinar series. Your comments and suggestions really help us to improve the resources that we offer and best plan for future webinars. So that link will be posted in the chat box, and please take some time to let us know what you think. And with that, I would like to give a very big thank you to our presenters, as well as to our audience today for posting comments and questions and making this an engaging session. So thank you, everyone, and thank you as well, Anne and Josie, for taking the time to share your work with us today. Do you have any final words that you'd like to share before we sign off?
No, we'd just like to thank the audience and you for inviting us to share our research. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. That's great. So, yes, good afternoon, I guess it is now, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today.